Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segments we have discussed the abnormal views of each of the thinking and communication types on the R scale and the Z scale. In this segment we will continue with abnormal processes by looking into the abnormal thinking type, which is referred to as cyclic thinking. In a constructive sense, a cycle of communication is meant to contain a beginning, middle and end in a way that adds up to a specific interval ratio unit of information. Once this interval ratio unit has been achieved, the communication cycle can be compressed and stored within the structures of the brain. In an abnormal or irregular sense, this interval ratio unit will not be achieved or will be exceeded. Once this happens or until this is resolved, the resulting communication can be related to a process of cycling thinking. In cyclic thinking, the irregular amount of information will cause a continuing issue when trying to achieve a communication cycle containing a standard unit of information. The extent to which this occurs is measured by the communication type within cyclic thinking. The first communication type within cyclic thinking is referred to as circular thinking. In circular thinking, the tendency is for the abnormal amount of information to be recognized and resolved by way of deferring or ignoring the cycle by recognizing the abnormal amount of information. From there, the next cycle of communication can easily be completed in a standard fashion. This type of circular thinking is related to a process called a disruption. The disruption will easily be recognized and can be ignored in favor of continuing to experience constructive communication in subsequent cycles. The main attribute of the disruption and of circular thinking is the temporary effect on constructive communication. The second communication type in cyclic thinking is referred to as ovular thinking. In ovular thinking, some amount of the irregular information associated with either a single or multiple communication cycles becomes compressed in a way that leads to an abnormal amount of information being utilized during subsequent cycles of communication. In ovular communication, the dissolution of the previous cycle of communication will influence and change the subsequent cycles of communication on a consistent basis. This is especially true when communicating with specific people related to those communication cycles. Ovular communication is related to a process known as a derangement. The experience of a derangement is caused by an unresolved disruption or a continuing disruption or a disruption that has not been adequately deferred. One of the main features of the derangement is its effect on subsequent cycles of communication, especially when communication with others who were involved with that communication. It is important to note that a derangement is more likely to affect a small number of communication cycles and are less likely to affect communication with new individuals and groups or individuals and groups who are not closely related to the communication that caused the derangement. Also, there is a high likelihood that the derangement will resolve itself over time or over some number of meaningful communication cycles. When these problems do not resolve themselves, they become more closely related to elliptical communication, which is the third type of cyclic thinking. In elliptical communication, the tendency is to base all communication cycles on the continued derangement regardless of situation or who is being communicated with. During this step of cyclic thinking, all subsequent communication is affected by whichever process has been left unresolved. Another possibility is the lack of awareness of the derangement or lack of awareness of irregular or non-standard communication. In that scenario, the individual who displays elliptical communication may be unaware that their processing is non-standard or irregular. One main attribute of this communication is the display of these irregular intervals regardless of who the individual communicates with. This leads to abnormal processing whether or not the subsequent communication has anything to do with the other parties communicating or not. This is most closely related to a process that can be considered to be a traditional mental illness. At this phase, most of those individuals dealing with those irregular cycles of communication can be counseled or made aware of what they are causing or what they are going through. From there, the realization or actualization of their condition could potentially lead to the mitigation of their problems. At this phase, the individual would likely be open to suggestions or be willing to work on whatever their issue is found to be. If not, their condition could be described by the fourth step of cyclic thinking, which is referred to as incongruent communication. In incongruent communication, the amount of irregular communication cycles has exceeded a specific threshold of related informational processing. At that threshold, the proportion of irregular processes far exceed the proportion of constructive cycles of communication. After breaking that threshold, the individual must face the problem of no longer being able to communicate constructively. At that point, the individual will no longer organically attempt to communicate in most situations. There is a likelihood that every cycle of communication will be presented though derangement, with the consideration of constructive communication being reserved for others who display similar derangement. This relates the entire process of dynamic reciprocation to derangement and relates any other process to the ultimatum that the communication will fail. When dealing with incongruent communication, two main problems can present themselves. One is the problem of impulse, in which the amount of impulse associated with the related derangements exceeds the total amount of capacity of communication. With this problem, the interpretation of each cycle of communication can become a mixed bag, with one cycle being related to a positive impulse, the next with a negative impulse, the one after that negative, after that a positive impulse, and so on, especially when dealing with a single context or single situation. This overload causes the purpose of the communication to be poorly understood and poorly communicated. For that reason, the communication can be considered incongruent. The second problem relates to the amount of subtraction associated with each communication cycle. In that sense, a single or repeated impulse can relate to an irregular or unknown amount of information in a way that relates that impulse to an unknown or poorly compressed situation. With this problem, the interpretation of the situation, whether positive or negative, is poorly defined in relation to the context. In this sense, the magnitude of the context far exceeds the impulse related to the context. Similarly, the impulse might, in actuality, be unrelated to the context, which leads to the meaning of the situation being related to impulse only with a somewhat ambiguous correlation to anything else. Each of these, the first referred to as impulsive incongruence and the second as compulsive incongruence, are some main issues in the fourth step of cyclic thinking. These are both related to a process that can be referred to as a true disease. At the disease phase, the main attribute is a person's unwillingness to accept counseling or treatment regardless of what is offered to them. Their refusal to improve their condition is one of the main factors in determining the difference between the illness and disease phase. Each of these steps in cyclic thinking can be applied to the severity of diagnostics in traditional mental illness. These can be applied to traditional diagnoses by identifying whether the condition is related to a disruption, a derangement, an illness, or a true disease. The methodology of applying to standard theory can be discussed later. We have presented the abnormal thinking type referred to as cyclic thinking and its communication types, which are circular, ovular, elliptical, and incongruent thinking. Please join me in the next segments where we will discuss some special cases in standard theory, including the V-scale and D-scale.